Hello! I know it's been a really long time and I'm sorry about that. Today I'm going to be reading an essay that I wrote for my last class. And so for those of you who don't know me, I am currently working on my master's in European history. And this last class that I took was on the Philisophes of the 18th century, and I didn't think I was going to enjoy it until I actually started getting into the assignments, and then it turns out I did, like, kind of a lot. So I thought that I would share an edited version of my essays with you because I thought the subject was interesting and maybe somebody else will too. I do apologize that these aren't going to be terribly visually interesting and there's sort of a background hum because I'm in a hotel room and I don't have a lot of control over the sounds in this space. All that being said, I will be reading my essays. I don't have a good teleprompter set up here, and so I'll try and keep it interesting with like gesticulations and stuff, but please forgive me. Without further ado, let's go. Lumiere was frequently employed by the Philisophes of the 18th century to describe themselves with regard to their work in the all-consuming task of pushing society further away from the darkness of ignorance. Fittingly, Lumiere translates from French to light, as providing light is exactly what the Philisophes were trying to do. Provide illumination on subjects ranging from metaphysics to philosophy so that they, society, may grow and progress as a whole. Today I'm going to reflect on two primary questions: what is the Enlightenment in the context of the Philisophes of the 18th century, and what drove the Philisophes' need for enlightenment? In his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment?, Immanuel Kant defines it as man's release from his self-incurred tutelage, with tutelage further defined as man's inability to generate original thought or make decisions, being ever guided by higher earthly powers. Man can only achieve enlightenment if he is free to pursue it, and his freedom to pursue his enlightenment was only achieved by throwing off the yoke of his social guardians. In the case of Kant and many of the Lumieres of the time, the primary social guardian to be concerned with is the guardians of the church. In Jean-Laurent d'Alembert's essay, The Human Mind Emerged from Barbarism, it's implied that men of small attainments or of evil intent who openly made war on philosophy were also the guardians of the church. For it's through the philosophical musings of man that scientific thinking can be developed, and even sagacity to prove the existence of God is considered dangerous and potentially damning. D'Alembert references the works of Francis Bacon as an early and esteemed attempt to categorize what is known and what is yet to be known, as well as the need for scientific experimentation to further the contributions necessary to make us better and happier. He also speaks of Descartes, who is referred to as the man who changed the fundamentals of philosophy due to his powerful imagination, extremely rational mind, knowledge derived from himself more than from books, courage to combat the most widely held prejudices, and an independence which gave him the freedom to criticize. These great men, who predated and heavily influenced the Philisophes of the Enlightenment era, are both examples of Kant's ideal of a man on the path to enlightenment. More so Descartes than Bacon, these men dared to think beyond the fetters of the existing schools of thought. Bacon held his desire to define the things he knew he did not know, while Descartes employed his incredible ability to find use for ideas pertaining from one subject to explore and expand upon another, such as his application of algebra to geometry. The removal of the yoke of scholasticism, public opinion, and authority that creates and maintains prejudices and attitudes that encourage stagnation is the first step towards freeing oneself from incompetence and achieving a steady pace towards enlightenment. And yet, it's undeniable that both of these men were men of deep faith. And it's apparent in Bacon's work, where he frequently refers to the masterpiece of nature being too good to have been anything other than designed. Meanwhile, Descartes dedicated much of his philosophical musings towards proving the existence of God, yet he was lambasted as atheistic by his critics. So even the fathers of philosophy, and thus the Enlightenment, were not immune to the societal expectations of clericalism and piety of their time. Now, it is important to note that Enlightenment as a concept was more than anti-clericalism. The Philisophes in France like to speak of a century of light. These men consider themselves the light bearers of their century, providing illumination on a myriad of subjects, the most relevant of which included classicism, antiquity, politics, science, and religion. The Philisophes strove to be a modern thinker, but more importantly, an independent thinker, which as a concept is kind of amusing when you compare the great works of like Voltaire, Johnson, Hume, Kant, D'Alembert, and you can find a similar undercurrent in favorite subjects such as Stoicism and the blindfold of ignorance deployed at the behest of current doctrine. These concepts can be found in works such as Candide by Voltaire and Rasselas by Samuel Johnson. Please don't murder me for that pronunciation. The Philisophes' heyday was marked and can be directly linked to the invasion of theology by rationalism. Scientific ideas were not being outright rejected by the church, and miracles of the past were starting to be analyzed with a new, more critical eye, and modern philosophy was beginning to creep into modern theology. It was not uncommon for the educated man in the 18th century to reject superstition and to instead turn to scientific or psychological explanations that may not immediately have been apparent. However, the philosophe was still a radical. He utilized the existing hierarchy to reach his own means, but he called for its abolition with every publication. It's not just clericalism that plagued his society, but it was the clerics that kept the masses ignorant enough to be complacent with the current state of being, and the crime of complacency was unforgivable to the philosophe, for complacency bred a lack of progression. And progress was the philosophe's primary, if honestly ambiguous, goal. Now, the concept of progress to a philosophe appeared more often as a sort of utopia, perfect and naive in its obtainability. In The Future Progress of the Human Mind by Marquis de Condorcet, he pinned his hopes on the future for the condition of the human race as subsumed under three important heads: the abolition of inequality between nations, the progress of equality within each nation, and the true perfection of mankind. In his essay, he claims that French and Anglo-Americans have already reached the point of abolishing inequality between their nations by being led by the least prejudiced and most free of their civilization. And in 1794, the year of his death, George Washington was still serving as our new nation's president. France was in the throes of the French Revolution. But both of these countries had achieved what he was idolizing, which is removing the yoke of hierarchical blind leadership and installing free-thinking leaders in their stead. Mad King George is defeated, leaving level-headed George Washington to lead a new country. Extravagant King Louis XIV was violently removed from his throne, and in his stead was a president who was unanimously voted into office. To Condorcet, these are marks of freedom, and freedom was a necessary prerequisite to obtaining enlightenment, as found in Kant's essay, which was only published a decade before. Clearly, this was progress in the eyes of Condorcet. But even as he expounds upon that utopia in his essay, Condorcet muses about how far man and society still needs to come, and if it's possible that man will ever reach true perfection. Enlightenment as a journey towards tolerance and knowledge, with an end goal of truly original and free thinking, was and is still continual. The Enlightenment as an age was a slow-moving machine towards the separation of scientific and philosophical thought from the limitations of the time, that is, church, superstition, and societal expectation of complacency. While the Age of Enlightenment was not itself an enlightened age, it was an age of growth and development in both the physical and the metaphysical world. The apparent driving factor for the Philisophes was the concept of progress, which existed in a gray area with the ideal goal of reaching perfection as a society and as man. I don't know if we'll ever reach the level of perfection the Philisophes daydreamed of, and as a 21st person, I do know that progress is less of a linear movement and more of a waltz. One step forward, one linear step, one step back, two steps forward, one linear step, one step back. But you know what? It's movement nonetheless. If you're interested in any of the references that I used when I was writing this essay, they'll be linked in the description below. Primary are going to be the Portable Enlightenment Reader, which was edited by Isaac Kramnick and printed in 1995. I've got one random Archives of History Ideas page. And then also Peter Gay's Enlightenment, Volume 1, Enlightenment and Interpretation, which was published in 1967. Let me know if you liked this at all by giving it a like, and then maybe comment. I've got 2 or 3 more of these to publish, and they get progressively more polished as time goes on, because I've got my footing under myself as I was writing them. Hope you enjoyed. Hopefully I will see you next time.